Welcome to the Contagious Code Podcast, where we dive deep into code, learn practical skills, celebrate the beauty of engineering, and eliminate imposter syndrome. I'm Tejas Kumar, and I've been building on the web for over 20 years at places like Vercel, Spotify, Zeta, and more. Today, my guest is Daniel Lockyer. This is an extremely special and exciting episode because I believe this episode is going to empower you unlike any one other episode has so far. It's an absolutely jam-packed episode of the main thesis being you can just ship things. You can just ship things. Daniel Lockyer is a DevOps expert and the person responsible for deploying all of Peter Levels.io's stuff between Remote OK and Nomad List, all the properties of Levels.io that are used very heavily on the internet. Daniel is the DevOps person responsible for getting them online and scaling them to the high level of users that Levels' projects have. There's a big surprise here that comes as a surprise to some that all of this happens on one server. They call it the server. In this episode, we dive into the idea that you can just ship things. You don't need some platform like Fly.io or Cloudflare or Vercel, which those are great platforms with great benefits. But if you really wanted to, you just get a server and you just ship things. And in this episode, Daniel outlines how you can do that. Spoiler alert, it's not even complicated. You get a server, virtual or physical, doesn't matter, with some RAM, some CPU, and you just install a bunch of stuff on that. You install a web server, some services, usually using Docker or some container runtime, expose them to the internet, get a TLS certificate, put it on your domain, you're done. It's really, really, really basic and simple. There's no secret sauce in this episode other than the main vibe being you can just ship things. It's this episode which is like stop overthinking and just do it. And of course, Daniel outlines his process, like how does he ship things? How has he shipped all of Levels' properties? He talks a little bit through Levels' workflow of like, hey, there's just like one command that he now runs that does everything. And it's just so empowering. This is one of the most empowering episodes on this entire podcast. And so without saying more, I'll just leave it to you to listen to. I want Levels on the podcast. I know Levels probably is too big for this podcast or something, but now that we've had Daniel, I think it'd be so interesting to get the other side of the DevOps picture, right? Because like Daniel can deploy it, but Levels builds it. And if we get the build side of this puzzle, oh man, we can unlock so much for you. So just a public request, I guess, if anyone knows Levels or Levels, if you're listening, like I'd love to get this on the podcast. In any case, let's get on with the episode. I'd love to offer this to all of you at no cost, of course, but this is separate to my day job. So let's take a moment to acknowledge the sponsor and we get into this episode. Contagious Code Podcast is sponsored by Code Crafters. Code Crafters levels up your coding skills like no other, right? The way they do it is they have you pick a programming language, JavaScript, Python, TypeScript, and a tool like Docker or Redis or something like this. And then they have you build the tool from scratch in the language you choose. And by doing that, you get better at the language and better at the tool because you literally build it. It's really awesome. If you want to try it out, there's a free tier. If you want to pay for it, you can get a huge discount if you use the link in the show notes. That's tej.as/codecrafters. I'm really into this episode, and I hope you are too. Here's my discussion with Daniel Lockyer. Daniel Lockyer, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be here.
It's your name and the timing of our recording coincide really nicely because you want to lock in goals for your year.
Yeah, 100%.
Was that? I'm really excited to chat with you today on the podcast because you have created some things that are heavy traffic, and you're part of this movement that says, hey, look, you don't need more than a bare metal server. You can do a lot with a little, right? You don't need this whole Vercel double pricing situation. And some might not, but today we're going to explore the side where you might not. So I'm really excited to get into that. Before we do, would you be willing to share just a quick introduction to folks about who you are, what you've been working on, etc.?
Yeah, cool. So my name is Daniel Lockyer. I currently work at Ghost as my day job. Ghost is a publishing platform. It's open source, and all of our code is publicly available on GitHub. Technically, I'm a DevOps engineer at Ghost, but I know the industry doesn't really like that term, DevOps, as an actual job role. So what I really am is a software engineer, and I do quite a broad range of tasks. Front end, back end, infrastructure, quite a generalist. I don't really like to spend all my time working on one thing. Outside of that, I spend my time looking after people's servers. So I think the most notable one is Peter Levels on Twitter /X. And over the years, I've just come to love working on servers and experiencing the broad range of people's setups.
I think it's so funny that you self-identify as I'm the guy who manages other people's servers like Peter Levels. Like
Yeah.
this is your assumed I'm Levels the server guy. Interesting. Okay, I want to dive into all of that. And I really want to hear about Ghost because it seems like a generalist like yourself, one who understands all parts of the stack and can
Mhm.
stand up a service and then see it through scale. This seems like a very indie hacker profile. So like, why work for a company? I want to get into that later,
Mhm.
but for now, let's just start by unlocking skills. The whole reason this podcast exists, Daniel, is because people are scared of what they don't know. Right? There's a bunch of front end folks who are comfortable with like React and Tailwind and stuff, but they can build the UI. But when it comes to deploying the UI, it's like, oh, just use Vercel because I don't know how else to deploy stuff. And I think front end sites or UIs are pretty I don't want to say obvious, but they're more approachable to deploy, right? Because they're just static sites, ideally.
Mhm.
But when there's a server involved, this gets complex. So with that context, if there were listeners, and indeed there are listeners, who the extent of their comfort zone is, I'm going to make a React site,
Mhm.
but then I don't know what to do with it. And let's assume in this scenario, like Vercel, Netlify, Cloudflare, none of this exists, right?
Mhm.
How do we help them get stuff online?
Okay. I mean, I think the important thing here is to point out that it's not as scary as people think. There's a lot of misinformation, and there's a lot of drama out there about how complex some of these server stuff is. I think I even put a tweet out a couple of months ago where I just did a screenshot of HTOP on my Mac, right? And so HTOP is, for those who don't know, it's a piece of software that shows you all the processes. If you do this on a Mac, it is the most scary thing ever. There are hundreds and hundreds of processes. But if you go to a Linux server, it's not the case. It's very small. It's maybe 15 processes or something like that. And so I think when people think, oh, wow, should I run on a server? Shouldn't I? It's this scary Linux system, which is kind of a bit like Mac OS, but it's not. And then they go and open HTOP and they look at all these processes. It's like, wow, is this what I really have to deal with? And so what I would say is ultimately just to get started. I think that's how you learn the best is just to go and do it. There's a lot of information out there. I mean, these days with AI, I mean, ChatGPT, you can chat your way through pretty much any server problem. And I bet if you were to go and ask ChatGPT right now, like I have a static React app, I want to set it up on a VPS, help me. I mean, that must be the way, right?
So let's say ChatGPT gives you the reply of you get a server from somewhere and you SSH into it. What then? Because assuming it's a static site, you've got to create some type of HTTP server. So you could even just like run like npx http server in the local directory once you copy your static files over and serve it that way. But we both know that this isn't really ideal because you have no process management for starters, and the load isn't distributed. So maybe ChatGPT gives you an answer. Maybe it's invalid. How can somebody trust that? First of all, I mean, you're a senior, you're a well experienced person, but it could hallucinate something. So given that, what's the ideal way?
I mean, the ideal way is very context dependent, right? It also depends
Well,
on what your goal is here. If your goal is just to get some HTML onto a server so you can show it to the world, I think your solution has to be less, proper than if you were to build a, full-fledged business and, you're expected to scale to X number of requests per second or something like that.
yeah,
I think, the MVP solution here is,
yeah,
you get a server from, I don't know, Hetzner or Lino, DigitalOcean. There were many
Right.
Yeah,
And
so
these are all kind of the same, right? They're just a Linux box that runs stuff.
yeah, and very cheap. They charge you by the minute usually, and so even if you wanted to go and get access to one now, you can play around with it, you can break it, all this kind of stuff, install whatever software, and then delete it. You only get charged for the 10, 15, 20 minutes that you use it for. So basically what you're doing here is you're renting a server in a data center somewhere, usually virtual, unless you go for dedicated. And so what that means is you're sharing your server with other people on the hypervisor, which is fine, usually, never goes wrong. And so, then SSH,
I love it.
how
I
do you
love how you're
describe
breaking
that?
this down so basically. Yeah, SSH, yeah, sure. You just run a command SSH with the IP address and the username and log in.
Yeah, so open a terminal, SSH, root at IP address. You put
Come
your
on.
password in or your SSH key, whatever. And then you're in the terminal in your server. From there, if it's Ubuntu, you use something like apt. I mean, generally these days, a lot of people use NGINX, right? So probably go and install NGINX. ChatGPT can go and give you the config for NGINX, copy and paste that onto the server. You drop your files onto the server. I guess you need DNS. So you point your DNS to your server, and then it's kind of done, right?
Yeah, totally.
That's
So
the
to point your
MVP
DNS
there.
to your server, you go to a domain registrar by domain, and then they have name servers that you can literally just point an A record to the IP address of your server, and you're Gucci. Great, yeah. And then you have this Nginx server that serves your static site, I guess. What limitations are there with this? Like, when would somebody want to reach for more? And maybe we can pull in like real world examples from some of the properties you've worked on. We can talk. I do want to do like later after we get past this like entry level stuff, just for the listeners to take them on a journey. I'd love to get into Nomad List and Remote OK and what constraints there are there. But okay, so we have this basic Nginx thing working. It's working. We can serve like 50 users, no problem. Where along this journey are we going to realize we need a little bit more?
So ultimately, I think this scales quite far, and this is the crux of what I've set up with Peter Levels over the last 10 years. For those who don't know, Peter Levels runs all of his sites on one server. We use Nginx and we use PHP FPM because he writes his websites in PHP, but he serves billions of requests every month off one server. Granted, we also use Cloudflare, so I should probably disclaimer that. But there's no real need for him to go and scale to 2 servers or to set up more complex solutions than this.
Is this one server very, very, very resource rich? Is it some type of like 16 CPUs, like terabytes of RAM, or what are the specifications of this one server?
It has 16 CPUs, 64 gig of RAM, but we would actually like to halve the size of it. We do think it's actually quite resource over-provisioned at the minute. Reason being why it's so big is over the years, Peter's launched a lot of projects. Initially, the implementation is not the most efficient. Code is slow, and so to handle the vast amounts of traffic that he receives from like Reddit, Hacker News, Twitter, we've just scaled up the server and allowed PHP to use more threads than is ideal. Once the initial bursts go out the way, then we optimize it. We look at the performance. And so now, the service sits there, I think like 25% utilized or something like that. And so, I have 64 gig of RAM, but I think we only use like 6 or 7 at any one point. So, I would say we could actually reduce the size of the server. Now, unfortunately, it's not that easy because these VPS providers don't let you resize servers if the disk is larger than the, disk that you want to move to. But the cost is also trivial for the revenue, so it's not a big problem. We give ourselves a lot of leeway for that.
Incredible. So you can so this is your setup. It's the same thing we just talked about. You've got an Nginx instance, some Cloudflare load balancing, and caching.
Yeah.
But this is it. This powers like Nomad List, Remote OK, like all the properties of Levels and others.
Yeah, and this is why I like it. the setup here is so simple that debugging it is extremely easy. And I think this is one of the things that I love the most, or I value the most even about a system, is how easy is it to debug. Most of my job / career / hobbies ends up being some sort of debugging of a system. And it's the most frustrating thing when, you're sitting there for like days or weeks on end trying to figure out why, X problem is occurring. And you can't, because you don't have visibility into the system, or the system is too complex. But when you've got a system or a server, even like NGINX that proxies to PHP FPM, I mean, there's like 4 steps here. Request comes into NGINX, it goes to PHP FPM, it goes to your code. That's it. Peter doesn't even use like a traditional database like a MySQL or Postgres. He uses SQLite. So SQLite is really just a file. There's no connectivity problems with SQLite. There's no like firewalls with MySQL, whatever we have to mess with. So yeah, this setup is definitely the simplest and rarely ever goes wrong.
But if it's one SQL file or a SQLite file on one disk, with no connection between them, I mean, we all were somewhat scared of single points of failure. No? So there has to be some redundancy somewhere. But I guess redundancy also just looks like copy the SQLite file.
Yeah, so obviously we have backups. The redundancy, granted, so I think that's where we're lacking. There is no redundancy. Okay. If something goes wrong, we'd have to go and spin up a new server, copy the files, or like restore a backup or something. Now, what I would say is, me and Peter have been working together for the last 10 years. I can think of one time where the hypervisor, or like the server, has crashed, not because of our own reasons, and we had to restore from some backups. And so the risk of it happening is like one instance in 10 years. The time it would take for us to go and set up a different system and to maintain that system, and the complexity that system would bring, I don't feel would be justified in this case. So that's ultimately why we've kept it as simple as it is. Yeah.
Right. And can you explain shortly what PHP FPM? Sorry, I'm not a PHP person. What is PHP FPM?
Yeah, PHP FPM is it's an application that allows requests to come in, and it will run the PHP script for you.
So it's super basic. You have you have NGINX, you have that, and it just executes the code and renders some output. Is it are these applications multi-tenant? Like, do they have all the accoutrement of proper web applications, like user authentication? I assume they do. They have user authentication. They have a database. They have everything you'd expect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's very simple. Peter doesn't use any frameworks, so it's all very vanilla PHP.
Are there the automation steps of like GitHub push to a repo and it's auto deployed? How do you actually deploy? Do you have webhooks for that, or is it just like rsync every once in a while?
Man, this is a story. So for the longest time, Peter would FTP everything.
Wow.
He would develop locally using Sublime. He would rarely ever test locally, because setting it up locally was just a pain in the ass. You had to like copy the database files from the server. So he would just FTP everything live to the server and basically test in production. Eventually, I was like, dude, we need some like kind of change management, maybe, whatever. I convinced him to use Git, but Git was maybe utilized in the wrong way than I initially would have imagined. And so what he does now is it's all very public on Twitter, by the way. You can go and look at his story of how he moved to Git, but he still uses Sublime, I think. He has a keyboard shortcut that essentially does git add a, git commit, and git push all in one go. And the git commit just commits with a letter X, and that will go live to the server. So there's one keyboard shortcut that does git add, git commit, git push. And we have a little script on the server that does a git pull every 5 seconds, I think, like that. Wow. Very MVP. But again, it works. So
yeah. And this also makes it somewhat trivial to implement something like deploy previews. I mean, as a one-person team, it doesn't make any sense, honestly, to have deploy previews, but you could if you wanted to. Interesting. So then, if it's this simple, and indeed, I've literally done this before. I've got a Hetzner. Now, mine's a Kubernetes cluster because I want a little bit more redundancy. But if it's this simple, why are people afraid of it?
A great question. I think you should ask these people. Um, as I said, I think there's a lot of like scaremonger about how it should be or how it works. I think people also came up in a slightly different time for like developer, and not that I've been around for a long time. I've only been programming for like 15 years or something. But the way I got into programming was very MVP, teach myself, back to the basics, and nowadays people tend to jump straight for the most complex solution because it's also the flashiest solution, I think.
Right.
There's a lot of good advertising out there for various solutions, and advertising tends to win, right? So
you had a reaction when I used the K word. What? Tell me more about that.
Don't get me wrong. I definitely see the time and place for it. I've used it. I continue to use it now, even at Ghost. I think a lot of people do tend to jump for Kubernetes way too early and spend more time actually trying to maintain the cluster than writing the application to solve the customer problem or teaching themselves the thing they actually want to learn. Okay, if you're teaching yourself Kubernetes, then that's fine. But if you want to go and write a little tool to solve your problem, you should probably work on that rather than cluster configuration or whatever.
Yeah, rather than messing with Helm charts just because.
Yeah, and I've done that. I've spent a lot of time messing with Helm charts and messing with Kubernetes cluster configurations. And what did I really achieve, from it?
Yeah. Yeah. On the contrary, my experience with Kubernetes, I think it has actually really good developer experience. I think a lot of people say, oh, it's complex and it's difficult. But honestly, like the cluster that I'm operating, if we ever anticipate, like if we're at like 85, 90% capacity and we need another server, you can just generate a join command, get a new server, get a new virtual or whatever server, and just run this command on a new Ubuntu box, and it will just join the cluster, and everything will be load balanced automatically. Like it's that one command joining of a cluster. It's cool. It's very straightforward. Okay, I hear that you say that it's often overused. Probably because, again, it's the same thesis that you stated earlier, right? Like if it's more complex, it's more flashy, people want it for oftentimes no reason. Interesting. So I'm a little bit, I don't know, I'm a little bit lost for like if I'm struggling because I just can't compute something being so accessible yet not so widely used. It really like eludes me.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I often think, the questions I ask myself when I'm looking at any system are like, what's the simplest solution here? And often the simplest solution is the best solution. Like overcomplicating doesn't help anybody. There's a great resource on GitHub. I'll have to send you the link so we can put it in the notes or something. The page is called Cognitive Load, and I can't do it justice. People should just go and read it. But when I read this page, it really describes my entire like thesis of how I see software engineering. Essentially, the point is it is our job as software engineers to reduce the cognitive load of the solution that we implement or hand off to others. And he gives loads of really good examples, but I think of this on a day-to-day basis. What is the cognitive load of this system? Am I doing it justice by making it more complex? Am I doing myself a disservice by making it more complex? Often the answer is, okay, I can make it simpler. I don't need this complex solution. Jumping for XYZ, flashy technology, whatever, it doesn't really help get the problem solved or the mission complete. I think we spend a lot of time in tech, like arguing about the technology, but it doesn't really matter. What really matters is solving the problem, whether it's customer problem or your own user problem, right? So
yeah, it's interesting. We have a discussion on the podcast from I think a long time ago. I think it was last year with Guillermo Rauch, the CEO of Vercel.
Yeah, sure.
and he, I brought this up with him too. I was like, look, Levels is saying all this. What do you think? And he had a very respectful response, right? He was like, yeah, Levels works with a different set of constraints than we do. And the thing that he said that justifies the sort of fancy solution is there are things when you're managing your own infrastructure that you have to deal with that can be difficult and even problematic. So things like, for example, operating system upgrades or security patches or, vendor downtime. Like if Hetzner decides, hey, we're just going to like reboot our machines, well, then your users suffer. So all of that. And of course, if you have Kubernetes, you can, if one machine goes off, it doesn't matter. All of that, Guillermo says, is worth paying for, and I think some would agree. But it gives credit to this fancier solution. Now, in your 10 years of doing all this stuff like fully manually, how has that shown up in practice?
Yeah, great question. There have been difficulties with software and installing the software over time. PHP, I think when we started was like v5.3 or something like that. Then there was
It's the first version I started with.
Yeah. Then there was the jump to 7.0, and then there was like 7.1, 2, 3, 4, and then there was the jump to 8. All these have pain points. There are Ubuntu version upgrades that are incompatible with NGINX version upgrades and PHP version upgrades. It is a pain. Don't get me wrong. And just to jump back slightly, I'm not as black and white about the choices of technology. I think people should use what they know best. I think they should use whatever is simplest, whatever that means for them. For me and most of the people that I chat to, my friends, a lot of us use servers because that's just what we know best. It's also a very cost-effective solution. I'm not against platform as a service. I use like Netlify, Heroku, these kind of things. Whatever gets the job done, essentially. Yeah.
Okay, so it's a pain, and there is no easy answer to this, and so the easy answer for those who find it way too painful is indeed just go use one of those platforms as a service.
Yeah, possibly. There's definitely things you can do to make it easier. There are tools like Puppet, Ansible, kind of to automate the setup, to manage the server. Salt is another one. This allows you to create your server as like some files, some state code, and then you can essentially apply the state to a server. I want to go and install the latest version of PHP. Now, if you did that from the start, you may be in a better place than trying to introduce it halfway through. We do not do this with the server for Peter. But then again, it also, the day-to-day pain of running it is very minimal. To be honest, I can't remember the last time I SSH'd into the server.
Wow. So it's like fully automated.
Yeah.
Wow. Incredible. So it's literally just set it, forget it. Peter does his thing. He types his whatever commit shortcut and has an X in there and just auto deploys and everything's just done. You said you can't remember the last time you SSH into the server. Can you remember the last time you had to deal with some gnarly upgrade, or is this also just like a forgotten memory?
Yeah, maybe it's forgotten memory.
Bro.
As I said, there was definitely the whole problem with Ubuntu upgrades and PHP upgrades. Like at some point, PHP, the latest version, whatever 8, whatever it was at the time, 7.4, they weren't offering like pre-built packages for the Ubuntu version that we were on. So I had to go and like manually compile them, or I think I even used like a third-party apt repository. But for me, it's not too bad. It's like day-to-day business of using a server. So
we've spoken with some really awesome DevOps experts on this podcast. I must admit, we spoke to Matt Billman, co-founder of Netlify, who the guy is a genius. I think there's no question. He just really knows his way around systems. And I asked him also, questions about this space, right? Because he built Netlify's infrastructure from scratch. And one thing that he mentioned was at an early stage, like with Netlify, you just got to build it. You can't you can't explain to people what the problem is because they don't get it. They sort of just make it. They make the conclusion when they see the problem. To that end, have you thought of like productizing your setup slash? It seems like you offer a service to levels and other people, but you could just as easily like build the automation that you have as a product and sell it. Has this come across your mind?
Yeah. So I think the useful thing to talk about here would be where I come from in terms of my programming history. So to go back a few years, I left university. I studied computer science at university, and I was part of this whole digital nomad scene. So I went to Asia. All my friends were also traveling around. I was freelancing at the time, and I was doing website performance consulting and server management. And so that's essentially what I did for like 2 years. I was working with small businesses as a freelancer, looking after their servers, maintaining them. Trying to productize it was quite difficult. I think there is an area which I didn't manage to find at the time in terms of like the size of the business, whereby business wants to use the server, but also doesn't want to hire somebody in-house. They would be happy to hire somebody external, and they don't want to go and use one of the many platform as a service providers. Eventually, it got to the point where the clients I was working with was too small, and so that's when I joined Ghost. But I do think there's some area out there at the minute where you can productize some sort of server management. I mean, there are a lot of products like this. For hosting WordPress sites, there's a lot of like managed WordPress on your own server, like bring your own hardware kind of thing. I think that's what they've done quite well. I've used one recently. It was quite nice. Yeah.
Awesome. So yes and no. Like you thought about it, but it wasn't. It wasn't as desired as you'd think, because the people who would go for something like this would probably just go for Cloudflare, Netlify, whatever, and they didn't want to outsource that. Interesting. I also brought up Netlify and Matt Billman because Netlify, Matt talked about this controversy they had earlier last year where someone's Netlify bill was like from nothing or $20 a month to like 30,000. You may have seen this, and it was like a disaster for them. Of course, they refunded the money and so on. But Matt talked about traffic spikes and a platform like Netlify prioritizing and protecting. And he used this language. He said prioritizing and protecting that moment for the founder, that moment on Product Hunt where your thing blows up and out of nowhere there's like 300 million users, right? And any system that is monitored and firewall would probably be like, oh, there's some botnet attacking me or something. But Netlify let it through because their whole business model is we need to protect that. And they did invoice the user for that, but refunded it later. In any case, a platform like Netlify and Vercel, Cloudflare, etc., can do that. Levels is known for shipping some very popular things. I assume you've, in the past 10 years, had to deal with traffic spikes of a similar nature. Can we speak to that complexity? Like, okay, we've gone through the server setup. That's great. It works well. We've gone through process management. That's fine. But what happens when, you set up your server, just maybe 100 users or something, but then something happens, like Levels will do a talk or something. I don't know if he does talks. And out of nowhere, like, how do you deal with that situation? Like when it's fully manual?
Yeah. So this has happened a lot over the years. I think it happened a lot more in like the first half of the 10 years when he was like actively launching projects basically on a weekly cadence. I was at university at the time. I would go to sleep one night, I'd wake up the next day, he launched a new product.
Wow.
He'd bought the domain, he'd written the MVP code, and it was live on like Hacker News, Product Hunt, or whatever, Twitter, Reddit. This happened all the time. And yeah, in fairness, the performance did suffer. But you learn a lot. So this is before we used Cloudflare. Cloudflare these days soaks up a lot of traffic, mostly static assets, right? Static assets are probably the one that you're gonna get hit the most because any one HTML page may have like 50 images on it or something like that. Also, just levels of caching, within your application itself. So, making database requests, on the order of 10, 20, 100 per page load are probably not a smart idea. So we would cache everything. We would store. We actually did some crazy caching at some point. We would cache JSON files of the output from the
Responses.
database. Yeah,
Wow.
the responses. Yeah, and then we would just serve JSON files. And then when a new request come in, we would look at the modified time of the file. If it was older than a certain, or if it was younger than a certain threshold, we would just serve that file, and that works surprisingly well. I feel like these are the kind of things that you learn as a developer anyway, regardless of what platform you use. I think even if you were to go and use Vercel, Heroku, whatever, you're going to have performance problems. And yeah, they may scale a bit more natively, but you probably pay for it with a cost, right? So
Yeah.
at the very least, I think with this solution, there was no incurred cost or no extra cost that we incurred. Because the traffic bandwidth that you get with servers is incredibly generous, somewhere between 1 and 20 terabytes, and that is a lot of traffic to serve from a server anyway. So, yeah.
Wow. So you had to build the caching mechanism yourself. This whole let's just store the responses JSON somewhere on the file system, and then if a request matches and the parameters line up of youth, then just send this. This is all something homemade.
Yeah, basically. And the reason why it's homemade is because, again, Peter does not use a framework.
Yeah.
There are many great PHP frameworks out there. Well, most notably Laravel. And I'm sure caching comes out of the box with Laravel. But at the same time, this PHP caching solution we came up with was probably 20 lines of code extra.
Yeah.
It's store a JSON file. And then look up the timestamp and return it if it's younger than whatever.
So Levels doesn't use frameworks. I want to know why. Maybe one day I'll ask him if he decides to come on the podcast. But do you use frameworks? Is this just a thing that people do, or is he more an exception?
It depends. Yeah, I mean, I don't jump towards a framework if I'm going to go and work on some side project or whatever. I wrote little HTML apps myself, little tools that I want. Oftentimes, I would just go raw HTML, JavaScript, CSS.
Yeah.
The reason being is, again, it's simple. I don't have to mess around with build steps. Build steps are the bane of my life. I've spent many an hour debugging why some build system does not work. I don't have to go and learn some new CSS framework. I don't have to mess around with components or React or whatever. On the other end, if something gets significantly more complex in terms of logic, or I want to kind of standardize it, I want other people to use it, that isn't just this crazy HTML JavaScript implementation in my head, yeah, I'll probably go and use React or whatever other framework is suitable for this moment, right? I think if you have to ask Peter, it's just the way that he started programming. He wrote a single PHP file for most of the websites, and then it kind of just expanded from there. And then at some point, you're making enough money that you should probably just work on more features rather than refactoring your entire application into a framework. I think there's definitely an argument here as to the productivity lost from not using a framework versus the time it would take to convert to that framework. But again, it works well for him.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult thing to argue against when it does work well, not using a framework, and making money and solving customer problems.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'm building a little product on the side, and I decided to start with a framework, but I chose Astro because Astro is an extremely minimal framework. It doesn't have any interactivity. It doesn't have React. It's literally just a framework for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Meaning it just gives you a directory structure and really nothing else. And you can add React if you want. So I started building this with Astro, and it was naked, Daniel. It had nothing, just pure HTML, CSS, JavaScript. But then I went to go deploy this thing to Vercel just because I wanted to try. And everything broke. And I found out the week that I wanted to deploy this, Astro 4 became Astro 5. And there was some adapter that didn't work. It was just, and so I fully understand this pain when working with frameworks. At the same time, of course, if you want to build something highly collaborative, I think good luck finding a team where everyone can, work on a single PHP file. In any case, platforms like AWS, etc., also give you built-in heuristics for monitoring and alerting. And I know Hetzner
Hmm.
does also,
Yep.
although it's, I'd say, less capable than, let's say, AWS, for example. With
Yep.
CloudWatch, you could do a lot. What's the setup on? I like that we're calling it now the server, the single server that runs everything. What do you have going on for monitoring and alerting on the server?
So I don't think there's anything particularly crazy. We have a couple of tools that are written just to do like basic monitoring alerts. So like, for disk usage, CPU usage, RAM usage. These basically just run on a cron job every 5 minutes or so. And if they exceed some threshold that I've set, I don't know, 10 years ago or something. Well, probably not 10 years ago, 5 years ago. They'll send us a Telegram message. And
Oh wow, Telegram,
yeah,
nice.
yeah. And outside of that, we have a little script that I've called cron logger that wraps every cron job that we have on the server. I think Peter has about like 100 cron jobs running. It wraps every cron job, and it will report the status and runtime into an SQLite database. And then we just do like basic alerts on that, if the cron job fails, or, basic stuff. Outside of that, I don't really think we have a lot. I've installed stuff over the years. I installed like Telegraph. I installed Go Access for monitoring like NGINX logs. Ultimately, I honestly just find it easier just to go and like tail the file and then grep for the things I need. Yeah, keep it
This
simple.
is this is so cool. This is like paralleled with the people who like the coffee people. You know what I'm talking about? Like the people who who like get the beans and grind it with the little
Yeah,
brush
yeah,
and
yeah,
like,
yeah,
sort of feels like that. The meme men will do anything to avoid therapy.
yeah.
But it's so cool. He's literally like, bro, literally said, I just wrote a script that wraps cron jobs and sends reports to Telegram once in a while.
Yeah,
Bananas. And if I understand correctly, you mentioned you're not using any infrastructure as code, no Terraform, no Pulumi. It's just all
yeah,
copy paste.
yeah. On that server, we do not. Yeah.
That's just so cool. So it's really bare bones. What I'm hearing is anyone can do this. Literally anyone.
Mhm.
Like you said, Levels was doing, what was it, one product per day when you were in university.
Man, at some point it felt like that. 100%. Yeah.
Okay, so anybody can just go get a server, pay for just the minutes you use, and just
Yeah.
ship stuff.
Yeah.
People probably don't do this because they're afraid. I can speak for myself. I've never really done that, even though I know I can, just because I was like, what if it fails, And
Mhm.
I think that fear of failure is probably the reason, because I don't really hear from talking to you reasons about avoiding this otherwise.
Mhm.
Can we talk
Well,
about?
okay. Let's steal, man. What would be the reasons against? So, it can go wrong in like non-Googleable ways. Let's say. So, what do I mean by that? If like Heroku breaks, or if Vercel breaks, or if Netlify breaks, the problem is probably in the help logs, right?
Yeah,
And
and the
the button
community.
and the community, or the forum, whatever.
Yeah.
There's probably some button you have to press, or some setting you have to change. On a server, I guess the number of options that you can change is way greater, right? Even on even on a simple Ubuntu server, you'll probably run into things that are like deep Linux kernel, settings. So like one of the most common ones is the number of open files has a limit in Linux. I think it's like
Oh wow.
1024. And so depending on your application, I'm not saying that you would run into this, but you may run into this. And then the way it shows up as an end user, for your application is very non-obvious. It's only really when oh yeah, it's the open file limit thing, that you can go and fix it, right? I don't know if you would to give the error message from this to ChatGPT, it would probably be able to tell you this. But I will admit it can be it can
Be painful.
be painful. Yeah. And I think the advantage I have is my intuitive knowledge of how to solve these things is really just learned experience. Been running Linux and maintaining servers for like the last I don't know, 20 years, let's say. And
Mm.
so I've learned a lot about how to maintain a server during that time. I do have that
Right.
advantage. But what I'm saying is, I don't think you need all that knowledge, right?
Right.
99% of the problems I've seen do not happen. They're just super edge case that I've run into because I did a weird setup or something like that.
Right. And then probably another reason, just kind of riffing off what you're saying, to not roll your own is you get no SLA. There's no one you can complain to. There's no one you can sue. Worst
Yeah,
case, like
yeah, yeah,
it's all
yeah.
on you. The buck stops with you.
Yeah. And
Um.
huge opportunity cost as well. The time it takes to set up a server and maybe debugging it, your time you could be spent writing the application, whatever. On the other end, I have had many a time where these like hosted platforms also have the same problem. I run
Yeah.
into some issue with it, and then because I can't go and fix it, I have to wait for somebody else to go and fix it. And that could also be just as long. You have to go through first line support, you have to try and get it escalated, you have to like do back and forth about the actual error you're seeing. Yeah, you could argue both ways on this.
Yeah. Totally. Totally. And to give a real example, like this Astro 4, Astro 5 thing I just spoke about earlier was exactly that. I literally was blocked by Vercel, and I had to speak to their team, and there was a resolution eventually, but I thought, man, if I just put this on my own Hetzner thing, I'd be able to solve this much faster. So, totally. About the server, if we can continue sort of diving into it,
Mhm.
what security setup do you have? And specifically, I'm asking around like things like firewalls, incident response protocols, disaster recovery, key management,
Mhm.
etc. You've probably, I mean, in 10 years, I'd be hard pressed to believe that you haven't had like any security incidents worth remembering. So
Mhm.
I'm curious if we could speak to the security side again, because it's one of those things that you just get from Vercel or Cloudflare. You just get a web application firewall, a WAF.
Mhm.
But if you're raw dogging, so to speak, you've got to reason about this yourself.
Mhm. The thing that comes to mind here is the DHH talk at Rails World, I think, where he talks
Oh
about
yeah, the one
servers,
with the
right? And
memes.
yeah,
Yeah,
one of the memes. And, it was talking about security. Like the industry wants you to believe that, running a server is hard and securing it is difficult. And then he posts like the slide with like 4 or 5 different commands. Like
yeah,
ultimately, yeah, that's kind of true. Adding a firewall, well, on the later Ubuntu versions, UFW, which is a firewall, is built in. I don't think it blocks anything by default, but you can do like UFW allow port 22 for SSH, port 80 for HTTP, and port 443 for HTTPS. And then you enable the firewall, and that's kind of that bit done. There's no more complexity you need there. For SSH, yeah, I mean, keys, don't use passwords. SSH keys, we have like two-factor on SSH, which is nice. Security, yeah, I mean, keeping software up to date is often one of the most important things, but also the application code that you write is probably the weakest link in the
link.
chain here.
Interesting.
Um, say probably even more so if you don't use a framework, because most frameworks probably, I don't know, it's difficult, right? Frameworks do come with security features, but at the same time, they're also a lot more exposed.
Yeah.
So if there is a vulnerability in it, you're likely vulnerable because you're using the framework. Whereas if it's your own custom code, um,
Nobody's gonna know how to exploit it.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Somebody specifically has to come and look at your setup, which is
Yeah.
likely not open source or whatever, right? So
Yeah.
yeah.
So incidents over the last 10 years. Anything worth
The worst one was what I said earlier with so we had a hypervisor die. So a hypervisor is like the big machine in a data center that runs your virtual server. The hypervisor died, and our server got restarted. Okay, no big deal. But because it died whilst we were writing some files, like the database was being updated or something like that, those files got corrupted. And so when the server restarted, yeah, the website wasn't up because the files were corrupted. It wasn't that difficult to recover from. It was just pulling the latest backup. I think we do backups like every 3 hours or something like that. So the data, we lost like 2 hours of data or something like that. That's probably the worst one.
Interesting. If the hypervisor died on your cloud vendor, though, was that not really that wasn't your fault? No, that wasn't.
Yeah.
That was out of the control of the DevOps engineer.
Yeah. No, it was not our fault, but it was my responsibility to fix it. Right. I think So I think that's the worst. What are the responses incidents have we had?
The fact that you're struggling to remember is wild. It's wild.
Yeah, on Peter's setup, honestly, not many. I really can't think of many. I mean, Ghost is different. It's a lot bigger. We have a lot more servers. We have a lot more customers. So we do definitely have incidents there, but that's an entirely different server setup than Peter's.
That's incredible. I mean, so security seems to be handled with newer versions of Ubuntu. For monitoring, just set up a cron job that just like greps from htop and sees utilization and sends an alert. All of this sounds extremely doable, and really, I feel like the title of this episode should just be like, "You can just do things. You don't really need." Just go get a server, bro. Start. Interesting.
Yeah. Again, I would strongly recommend to anybody that just wants to play around. You can go and sign up for one of these.
Which one's your favorite?
I mean, I'm not sponsored by any of these, but Hetzner recently is my favorite.
Yeah.
Reason being, I do like their UI. I think it's the cleanest. I've had bad experiences with DigitalOcean and Linode in the past, so I'm just moving on to the next one. Also, it's the cheapest. I think I have like a 4-core server with 8 GB of RAM for like €4 a month, €5 a month. Which, if you just want to go and use it for a day to play around, install some software, just really teach yourself something on, an 8-hour day, that costs what, cents? 20 cents or something. Yeah. And the learning you get is way more than 20 cents. So
yeah, totally. Like I run a 2-server Kubernetes cluster for production workloads so far, and it works reliably every single time. And the bill for this I get every month is €16. Absolutely bananas. It's cheaper than Vercel. For all that extra control that I get. And of course I have to do like upgrades and things myself, but I actually don't, right? Because like Hetzner does most of it for me.
Yeah.
It's absolutely bananas. So I fully hear you. I don't know. I'm just very impressed at how easy. Like I've known this also, but you bring to it an attitude of like, you can just do things. Why are you not doing things? Let's dive into your work at Ghost. How I want to talk about specifically the dissonance or the difference between the Ghost work and the server, so to speak, because I assume Ghost is you're a team, right? A team must use a framework, I think, just so that the heuristics are known to all developers, and it's also easier to hire. And given that you have more customers and more users, and it's a business, I don't know if Ghost is public or not, but at some point you're subject to audits and you're subject to compliance like SOC 2, etc. So with all of that, and I don't know that Levels' stuff is certified at that level, but in any case, what's the big differences between solo indie hacker DevOps versus business for-profit company with a team DevOps?
Yeah, they are completely different, and I think that's why I enjoy doing both of them. As you said, on one hand, that it's single server setup, one guy, PHP, NGINX, bit of Cloudflare sorted. On the other hand, it's Ghost. Now, maybe to give a bit more background here, Ghost is a non-profit, and so all of our numbers are public. We currently have 27,000 customers. Our ARR is about 7 million per year. But the product itself is completely open source. Most of my commits on GitHub are also open source. Ghost itself does not use a framework, but how do I describe? It has an unofficial framework that's its own.
Right.
It's Ghost has been around now for 11 years. And so most of the frameworks that exist now did not exist 11 years ago. On the front end of Ghost, we do use React in places, but we also use Ember. The back end, is pretty much custom framework Node.js. And so the way that Ghost is run is it's an application. It's one like container per customer. And so we end up essentially running 27,000 containers across servers. Yeah. And it's just a completely different set of problems. And that's why I like it, right? It's not keyboard shortcut, git add, git commit, git push. It's like proper git flow, branches, pull requests, release and rollout, procedure. We have like loads of monitoring internally, which is like, as I say, completely different from this setup with Peter, right? What else? I mean, the team, we currently have 35 people. I think 2/3 of which are engineers. What else?
I'm just surprised. Okay, so it's nonprofit. I think that's cool. I got that totally wrong earlier, and I think it's nonprofit, of course, after salaries are paid and things, right? Okay, that's really interesting. I'm curious. You said 27,000 containers.
Yeah.
Is this why Ghost uses Kubernetes? Because you need to then schedule those containers on various machines. Does it use Kubernetes?
We do use Kubernetes, but not for this purpose. Most of our use of Kubernetes is for like supporting services, like third-party apps. So to be honest, we don't really use it a lot.
Wow.
I think we have like 5 or 6 different web apps running on it. 3 of which are like not ours. They're like open source products that we can use. The way that Ghost Pro works internally is it's basically a custom platform as a service. That kind of grew organically over time. Again, Ghost has been around for like 11 years. It was released the same year that Docker became a thing.
Wow.
And so it didn't really have the advantage of like having like these solid foundations and that are well-established practices. It's kind of just grown over time, and we basically have our own pass.
Wow! Did you make that?
I did not personally make it. It was made by people before me, but I have definitely contributed to it. Yeah.
Wild. How long have you been at Ghost?
I've been at Ghost 5 years.
Okay. So about the halfway point. That blows my mind that everything's it's self-made there. So you've basically got your own internal version of like Vercel, Netlify, etc. Do you use GitHub?
We do use GitHub. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, Ghost is fully open source on GitHub. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So your deployments and things, for at least for like the marketing properties and the websites you have, use GitHub webhooks. Do you use GitHub webhooks and things for your internal pass as well to have these like on push deployments?
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
We have CI that runs on the front end. On the GitHub repo. It does like tests, unit tests, linting, that kind of stuff. Once they're all happy, we do like a Docker container build. We have since moved to Docker.
Nice.
I made that change like 2 or 3 years ago. We build a Docker container, gets pushed to the registry, and then we pull it down on all of our servers, restart all the apps. Restart all the containers, and they boot up.
Since everything's public and open source with Ghost, which I so respect, I'd love to dive a little bit deeper into this custom pass setup, and maybe we can start from like the very top of the reasoning stack, so to speak, where this is probably not a good question, Daniel. So you can tell me if you just don't think it's a good question. But I'm curious, if an indie developer like Levels set out to build an AI pass like this, where would they start?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the question, I think the real question is, would you do this if you were starting fresh today? Would you make a custom pass? And the answer is no. right? The reason why we have this, essentially custom pass is because that's just what's organically grown over time.
Yeah.
There was no Kubernetes, there was no HashiCorp nomads, there was none of the other self-hosting solutions that run at scale. And so, to be honest, no, you should not do this.
Yeah. Finally, this is the first time I hear Daniel say, "Don't do this yourself," because so far we've been talking about no, do it yourself. It's fine. Just SSH. Get a okay. So this is your line. This is where you're like, nah, it's not worth it.
If we're doing it fresh, I would not redesign it like this. But there are many solutions out there. Yeah, we could go and use Kubernetes. The question is, do we want to move the current system over to Kubernetes? I mean, we're having this, discussion right now. Even we've been having it for a few years, and yet we still end up with the pass. So,
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
the value out of Kubernetes is clearly not there. But
It's so expensive, this transition, and I know this because when I was working at Spotify, this was an internal topic all the time. So Spotify, also quite an old company, came up before Kubernetes, and also had this internal pass. It was called Helios, and same thing, right? It was. If I ask people at Spotify today, like, should we go with Helios or Kubernetes? They'd be like, no. Are you insane? Why would we roll our own container orchestration system? And so then there was an effort. I think this was after Kubernetes got adopted into the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, the CNCF, where there was this internal effort to migrate from Helios to Kubernetes, and it was so expensive. And I don't know, like, was it worth it? Was it not? I can't say, but if you're having that discussion now, and what's working is working, I guess. Why would you change it?
It's just a very difficult thing to do. There is a huge opportunity cost, and it's not really an opportunity cost. It's an actual cost, right? You've got people's time and people's salaries. Of which, if you go and tell 2, 3, 4, 5 people to go and migrate the entire platform to a different system, they don't go and work on features, or they don't go and work on some other thing. On the other end, maybe if you were to migrate, it takes 6 months, a year or something. Maybe you can accelerate faster after that period.
I mean, you could even. Sorry to interrupt you.
Sure.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say what you could even do is have both for a period, right? Have a Kubernetes cluster, schedule some new containers on that one, and then incrementally, every time you restart a container, just have the new started container start in the cluster, as opposed to whatever custom pass you're running.
Yeah, definitely. Straddling the two would be an option. I think we've discussed that in the past. I think the downside is it becomes a little bit more complex, because then you have two systems to run, right?
Yeah.
And you have to make sure that all of your tech decisions are compatible with both. Again, it's not really keeping it simple as such, so. But day to day, you do feel the pain of not having a standardized solution. We have many bugs written in our own code that would not be a thing if it was standardized by using like Kubernetes or very, very battle tested solutions that are out there.
Yeah. Does Ghost use for long term persistence also SQLite on disk, or is there something slightly different?
No, we do use MySQL, but we've discussed many a time about the switch to SQLite. So for the longest time, Ghost supported both SQLite and MySQL in production. These days, it only supports SQLite for development mode. Reason being is when you want an open source piece of software to support many database technologies, with a very limited team, the overhead of managing all these different technologies is very high, and so even on a smaller scale, the difference between MySQL, like the official MySQL version, and MariaDB, in theory, they're like drop-in replacements for each other. The reality is that MariaDB is not a drop-in replacement, and so we've had bug reports to GitHub, to our GitHub, where like something in MariaDB does not work, but it does work on MySQL. And so we've even had to drop support for MariaDB. There's just not enough time / people to maintain all these different technologies. And again, I would love to switch to SQLite. To be honest, I think backing up SQLite is the easiest thing ever. You just copy a file or rsync a file, whatever. MySQL backups I've seen take a long time to figure out how to do correctly, especially at scale, 27,000 sites, containers even.
And so with SQLite, it would be one SQLite file in a container. You back it up with a copy or whatever.
Yeah.
I want to get your take on, because you seem to be a fan of SQLite. I'm going to start saying SQLite for the remainder of this conversation, because that's what you say. There's companies like Terzo. You've heard of Terzo, that will take an SQLite database and edge replicate it across various points of presence, sort of like what Cloudflare does for static assets, but for a SQLite database. It sounds interesting. In practice, would you see a benefit? Like, assuming Ghost was all SQLite databases, would you use something like that for maybe performance? I don't see the performance appeal, right? Because there's still a round trip between wherever your application is and then the SQLite database lives. So I'm curious if I could get your take on that as a DevOps expert.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think so. I think I've not yet seen the value add that these platforms bring. At least I've not worked, with applications where it would be a value add. I think for Ghost, keeping it on server or on some sort of shared mounted storage, that's often good enough. And the advantage is that wait, what do I say? SQLite, SQLite,
SQLite.
Yeah, right. The advantages are that it removes a lot of the complexities that MySQL brings. MySQL has the problem with connection limits. It has problems with authentication. It can also be very opaque, and you don't really know what's going on in the internals. Whereas with SQLite, it's a lot more obvious, and just backing up is way easier as well. So.
Nice. So if you were to rebuild Ghost from scratch today, it would basically be the levels approach with maybe Kubernetes, and actually that's it. Versus the levels approach with Kubernetes. So you can schedule like your 270K containers on a number of different nodes, but it sounds like the server or the levels approach is the one. And if you want a little bit more accoutrement on top of it, then you get Kubernetes. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, something like that. I think if I was actually to do everything from scratch, the interesting thing about Ghost is it's one container per user. Yeah. So if I have a site on Ghost Pro, which is our hosted platform, all of the traffic goes to one container. That's kind of strange, I think, for the way that most people write their applications. A lot of people do it multi-tenanted. So you have multiple users' traffic going into one application. I think what that would mean is you could really reduce the number of running containers just to, however many you need to serve your number of requests per second. So you could actually get away with not doing 27,000 containers, and you could do 50. 20.
Wait a second. Sorry, you when you said 27,000 users, do you mean site admins of Ghost sites, or do you mean people consuming those sites?
Site admins.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. Yeah. Okay, now I understand. Yeah.
The reason why Ghost is kind of single tenanted at the minute is because it's decentralized. I can go and run Ghost as a self-hoster, and to be honest, we've just never built the functionality into Ghost to scale it out to multi-tenanted use. Again, that would be a whole other thing to go and do to add multi-tenanted. Multi-tenant could be quite risky. You don't want people's data colliding with each other, that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Cool. I think together, Daniel, we've isolated a way of working, a protocol for anyone to build anything, which is extremely simple. Which I'm still I still have a hard time digesting. But your and Levels work is just proof that it just works. Even for Ghost, and this is why I wanted to dive a little bit into Ghost, because I was wondering, hey, that it's a different beast, but it sounds like this different beast would actually also benefit from the levels way.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the team know Peter, like personally, and so there is a lot of like this mentality of like, what would Peter do? That kind of thing, you know?
WWPD. I love
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
I love it. I wanted to ask you about photo AI. Peter's
yeah.
latest thing. I think he's adding like Tryon or something now.
Mhm.
Does that also lives on the same server as Remote OK and Nomadless?
It does, yes.
Do you it does AI stuff? Is this just like talking to APIs, or is it
Mhm.
actually running AI workloads on the server?
No, there are no AI workloads on the server. It's talking to APIs,
Okay,
which
well that's what.
allows us to get away with a lot if we were. This setup would be a little bit questionable, right?
Yeah, yeah.
We'd
That's
need a
that's
lot more
that's where
power
my
behind the scenes.
exactly that's where my question was coming from, because you would probably need to add a GPU to a Hetzner box somehow, or get one
Mhm.
with, yeah, it becomes a lot more complex. Okay, so it's composable. Have you experimented with DevOps in the AI era, to get like servers with beefy GPUs and run maybe machine learning training jobs, fine tuning jobs, inference jobs, etc.?
No, I haven't. Not yet. It would be interesting though because you you know your job would be to scale out your application or your training, whatever, to like thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of CPUs, GPUs, whatever, you know. I follow like the stuff that's happening at XAI. Man, they must be having a whale of a time at the minute.
Yeah, especially the DevOps engineers. The reason I ask is we had a guest on the podcast, John McBride, who works at the Linux Foundation, who it's a crazy story. It's just like the work that you do, where his company at the time, Open Sourced, was using a Gen AI product, and their Open AI bill at
Mhm.
scale was like $30,000-$40,000 a month. And they were like, why are we paying so much for this? And they decided, let's just find an open source way to build this in-house. And
Mhm.
so they ended up doing that. They did a bunch of research, and they found all you need is a model, which is
Mhm.
just a 70 gigabyte GGUF file, and a inference engine, something like VLLM or Olama. And you need a server like from Hetzner where you can run this stuff. In
Mhm.
fact, Olama enables me to run like machine learning models on my Apple Silicon here. So it's like Docker, right? But for machine learning. Anyway,
Mhm.
so what he ended up doing was getting a machine with a GPU added to an existing Kubernetes cluster as a node, and then just in his Kubernetes manifest, in one of his deployments, just said, "Look, when you schedule this pod, schedule it on that machine with a GPU."
Mhm.
And that's all it took. Surprisingly, that's all it took. And their bill went from 30 something thousand to $30
Love
a
it.
month.
That's
Yeah,
great. That's the stuff I love to see, where like clearly using some sort of API would be extremely expensive,
yeah,
but then you go set up your own little solution. You run a server, you add a GPU, build jobs by what 100-fold or 1,000-fold, whatever.
exactly,
Um, yeah.
exactly. Okay, let's bring it home. I want to talk to you about the evolution of DevOps. You've done this for levels this way and others. I'm sure you maintain DevOps. You're not just like levels DevOps guy, and
Mhm.
Ghost's DevOps person. You probably have a bunch of stuff. You've been doing it this way for 10 years. You can't remember the last time you had a significant pain point. Looking forward, especially now in the age of AI, how do you see it evolving? You think it'll just stay this way? Like we'll just keep doing it the way we're doing it, and everything's gonna be the same? And I ask this because I just shared with you the story of John McBride. Like all you do now is you just get a server with a GPU, maybe.
Mhm.
Yeah. What can we do? Some projections and predictions.
Yeah, good question. I mean, I'm following a project on Twitter at the minute called Coolify. I don't know if you've seen this.
Yeah, it's like Vercel, but deploy it yourself and host it anywhere.
Yeah, I love it. It's great. We need more of these projects. As I said, maybe running your own server, the very intricacies of like setting it up and whatever might be a bit too much for some people. However, with something like Callify, it's one command, you run it on the server, and then you basically never have to log into your server again, right?
Crazy.
Everything goes into this like kind of pass UI, and I use it. I use it for my own stuff. I connect it to my GitHub account. I deploy stuff from one of my GitHub repos, Docker files. I've got webhooks set up, and to me, that's the nice middle ground here that probably a lot of people, would enjoy. They still have the cost benefits of their own server. They have the full flexibility of being able to go and do your own thing. But then it's not totally manual, You still have like flashy GUI, buttons and user accounts and that kind of stuff. I think we're just, getting into the start of these kind of tools, and
Yeah.
it's really exciting to see because as I said, I don't necessarily disagree, or I don't have many issues with a lot of these huge PaaS providers, but they're not. There is a time and a place, and people like me want to run their own servers. They want to solve their own sets of problems that aren't necessarily other people's technologies, and so yeah, I look forward to it.
Yeah, yeah. I think to add to what you're saying, I think one of the biggest pain points that I've heard from DevOps experts like yourself in the past is also the one about, because you mentioned Coolify solves a lot of these pain points.
Mhm.
Another one was long-term persistence, but you've mentioned multiple times SQLite is the solution. So
Yeah.
I don't know if Coolify uses SQLite, but it seems like a match made in heaven. And then you've got literally everything from this one service. Awesome. I haven't actually used Coolify. I just know of it, but I'd love to give it a try. I have my servers, so why not?
Yeah, it's great. I mean, again, I get to run like a $3 or €3 whatever
Yeah.
server. I install my software, I install Coolify onto it, and I can run any application. And some open source products as well, like Cal.com, or I can run a MySQL instance. I can run
So
Ghost on it
cool.
even, self promotion. And yeah, so it's,
Do you feel like you can just build anything? Do you feel like if you had the next idea for whatever product, like levels, like you can just like
Mhm.
have the idea, build it, ship it, next. Do you feel that level of confidence?
I uh, I'd say so. Yeah. Reason being is I'm quite a generalist,
Yeah.
and therefore I'm not really like turned away from any of the like areas. Some people only want to be back-end engineers, they only want to be front-end engineers, they only want to be infrastructure engineers. To be honest, all of this is really interesting to me. I'm just as happy digging into some React bug, re-rendering problem, than I am like figuring out why firewalls aren't working on a Linux server. I think even more so with AI these days, you
Yeah.
pretty much can build anything. I love AI and how it's come into like the developer world. I know a lot of people don't like it, but for me, the absolute very least, it's almost like a smart autocomplete. That's how I probably use it the most. I know what I want, but I just can't type it fast enough, and AI can do that for me. And so, that combined with maybe a framework or, some technology, yeah, I mean, I don't see why, me or anybody can't build the next
Right.
whatever.
And this feeling must be deeply satisfying. I mean, because with this feeling of I can build anything, probably also comes the feeling of I can work wherever I want. And so then you get to pick a company that aligns closely with your values. Say a company that's non-profit for starters and fully
Mhm.
open source and all of this.
Mhm.
For those listening that feel like they're not quite there yet, what advice can you give them to help get them to that level? And if I wager a guess on what you're about to say, it's probably going to be something like maybe not go to Thailand and nomad for a while, but instead it's going to be just build a bunch of stuff. Just keep
Yeah,
building a bunch of stuff. Is that close?
yeah, absolutely. I think just to go back to the start of my programming career, the reason why I got into programming in the first place was because I loved the game Minecraft, right?
Oh, really?
Uh, yeah, I love the game Minecraft. I would play it with I play with my school friends, and I would run a custom server, and this custom server had support for plugins, and I wanted to write a plugin, and so I taught myself in one summer. I taught myself Java through trial and error, and I would literally like run into like a null pointer exception. I'd be like, what is that? Let me Google it. I taught myself about null pointer exceptions, which I had a lot back then. Uh, and I wrote plugins. And then my programming history kind of just progressed from there. I added more things. I experimented. I added more languages. I experimented. I wrote little apps to solve problems. I helped out friends who use languages I didn't even know, anything about. It's really just, I really enjoy programming, for one. It's like a little battle in my head of like, there's a problem, I need to solve it. What's the path through the code, that kind of thing. And, if you become really obsessed with programming, it almost like lives in your head, Sometimes I go to sleep visualizing the problem. And, I run a lot. So when I'm out on a run, I often think about programming problems. And solve them in my head. I come back. To anybody, people who do ask for programming, advice or just how to progress. It's really just find the thing that you love in programming and pursue that. Thankfully for me, it's do it a lot. Thankfully for me, it's a very broad range, so I don't really get bored. I think maybe some people get kind of burnt out in the same area after a while, but me, I can go head deep into React, and I learn about all these different problems, or servers, or backend, or analytics, whatever the problem is. So
I feel exactly the same. I've been writing code since I was 8 years old, and I just love it. I started also not with Minecraft, but with games in general. And I made a game once called Ghost Wars, where you have a little ghost and I have exactly the same feeling towards, and I think this is the thing: is you have to love it. And I think there's just a lot of people who want the money and the sort of comfort that comes with it, but without actually loving it, right? And I think that's probably where you can still program, but you're probably not going to arrive at this place of I can build anything ever that I want, because you don't love it. Like, would you even love building things at that point? Probably not, I see that as a common trend. I think probably Levels also, I don't know him, but he probably also got into it really young, and I think it's maybe just the young thing. Okay, are you the kind of person who codes on the nights and the weekends and things, or do you? What I'm trying to ask is, how do you maintain healthy balance between something you love so deeply and you're obsessed with versus regular life stuff? And it's not a valid answer to say I go running, because I know that's a hobby of yours, and you can't be like I swap one hobby for another. This is still not like balance. What I'm talking about is like life stuff, like the laundry,
I was going to say running, and then now you've banned me from saying that. I'm going to say I don't have the balance. So to give a long story short, the way my brain works is I get deeply obsessed by whatever the latest problem I'm trying to solve is, and it's all I can think about. I get sucked into the laptop for 8 to 10 hours a day, and really the only reason why I leave the laptop is bathroom, or to go running, which is something I also do daily. So to be honest, for me, it's just very all-encompassing, and I think it's a blessing and a curse. When you are really context loaded on a problem, you can basically solve whatever problem you set your mind to. On the other hand, I think living inside a computer probably isn't also healthy. So it's good to get out a little bit. Thankfully, I do have a girlfriend, and she also encourages me to step away. So, sadly, we also go running together. So
I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. So the reason I ask this question is because I recently published a blog post that some people are saying is copium and unhealthy, and like it's heavily criticized. But the title of the post, Daniel, is it's okay to code on nights and weekends, because I've people, well-meaning people, have told me, hey, maybe do something, maybe go touch grass, or maybe do this other thing, or maybe have some balance. But I function exactly the way you mentioned also, which is like I think of a problem and then I try to solve it. and then I can't solve it, and then I get
Hmm.
obsessed. I'm like, oh my gosh, what's going on here? And then
Hmm.
I spend like the entire day talking to Cursor, Claude, and like all these
Hmm.
LLMs, and I was like, what's going on? And before you know it, it's 11 p.m. right?
Yeah.
And this happens multiple times. And I also have a wife, and we go visit her family, and sometimes I don't even know what to say to them because my head's like I'm sure you can relate. So um
100%. Yeah.
I figured, and here's the thing, man, like when I've taken the advice from other people who well-meaningly told me to go try something else, I tried video games, and guess what, like I find puzzle games that like hit exactly the same spot, you know.
Hmm.
So I think whatever, if you find purpose in it, it's great, you know.
You know, for me, I get a huge dopamine rush from solving some sort of programming problem or a bug or adding a feature, whatever.
It's like
Um,
cocaine.
yeah, definitely. Maybe worse than cocaine. I've never done cocaine. Um,
Same.
um, I think definitely when I was younger and when I was at university, I would spend a lot more hours that did lead into the night. I think these days, yeah, I am pretty known for being on my laptop right before bed. And then I drag
Does that
myself
affect your
away
sleep at all?
and go to sleep. I don't have that problem.
Oh,
And I do sleep, a good number of hours. What I would say though is I'm also really enthusiastic about running, and so I know that good sleep leads to good running, and so I also value my sleep quite highly. I do try and get away from the computer like at least 1 hour before bed, but then I've probably got my phone, so there's no real, you know, difference there.
I
Yeah,
like that he's just honest about this. Um,
yeah. I mean, you have to be, right?
yeah, yeah. Because some people will virtue signal, "Oh no, everything's perfect. I take all my creatine on time," and I'm just like, I'm glad that you're just a chill dude being real. In that spirit, look, we're in the last few minutes here, and I do want to spend some time just kind of talking nonsense with you,
Let's do it.
specifically around two things. One, you mentioned Minecraft. They just published a movie. Uh, what do you think? Is you want to go see it? You think it's going to be good? Have you seen it already?
I have not seen it. I had seen it; it was coming out. To be honest, after high school, I kind of stopped video games completely. It's just, I
Because you got
think,
obsessed with computers, even more so.
yeah, yeah,
Yes.
basically. When I was younger at high school, I'd play Xbox, PlayStation, Call of Duty, that kind of thing. Man, as soon as programming became part of my life, it was all encompassing.
Wow.
It's like I just can't stop thinking about. I see the code in my head. I rearrange functions. I think of how to solve it.
At what
And
age did
so,
you start?
so this would have been like 13, 14.
Wow, that's wild. Yeah, it's a good age.
It is. I think, some people start earlier. You said you started at like 8. I
Yeah.
was interested in computers before I started programming. I think I really stumbled my way through getting to the point where I was programming. I sort of tried HTML before this, but I just didn't really like it. It wasn't really my thing back then. And eventually I just, that kind of stickiness of like wanting to write a plugin for Minecraft was the thing that kept me at it. And yeah, it was literally 3 months straight over the summer of like debugging null pointer exceptions in Java with some guy on Skype who was helping me. Uh, and then yeah, I got hooked, and then it kind of just
And then you've
progressed from
had no
there.
life ever since.
Yeah, big problem.
Do you have fights with your girlfriend about time constraints with code? Is that too personal? Should I not ask?
No, 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 it's cool. Uh, Sometimes she is just as bad, you know.
Okay.
So my girlfriend is a product designer, and for her,
Oh,
it's like the designing is also like all encompassing. I think there are very strong parallels between the two. It's just that my like visual thing is like the code in my head, whereas for her,
yeah.
it's whatever she's trying to design, she'll rearrange it, change colors, change design, think of like other things out there. And so I think whatever your thing is, if you are kind of obsessed with it, or yeah, it takes over your mind. Okay, I think in the long run, maybe not the healthiest thing, but it means you're like shit hot at it, you know? You're
Yeah.
like super on it and context
Yeah.
loaded. And you solve things a lot quicker. I noticed that when I have a holiday from working at Ghost or whatever, I have 2 weeks off. When I come back, I'm not context loaded. and like I have to remember, like I have to come up the knowledge curve again. I have to remember the system, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. What? So you said earlier that you nomaded a while.
Yeah,
I'd love to follow this. So you started coding like I don't know 13, 14 with this
yeah,
Minecraft Java thing. You
yeah,
fixed that, and then somewhere along the lines you developed this like, oh my god, I love this, and it kept going, and slowly Minecraft faded away, and code became the front runner.
yeah.
At what point did you decide I'm just going to go somewhere else? And then how did that affect this love for coding? Were you still like sitting somewhere in some beautiful landscape, but looking at a laptop?
Yeah, kind of. So started programming in 13, 14. I think probably by 15, Minecraft dropped off. Around 18 is when I went to university. Um, I studied computer science, and I still, I think in tech, computer science is a very debated, degree, whether you need to do it or not. For me, I still love the theory of computer science. I didn't go there to get a programming job because I already knew how to write code. So I just wanted to learn like algorithms, and I wanted to learn, yeah, like
What's the
cryptography.
fastest sorting algorithm?
I mean, quicksort is one of them, but there are quicker ones depending on the data set, right? So
What's the runtime complexity of quicksort?
I don't remember that.
Yeah,
Is it
I
nlog
just
n?
asked. I have, dude. I didn't even go to school for that. I don't have a degree. I don't know. Yeah,
uh, Granted, I mean, I graduated university, what, 7 years ago now? Probably a
yeah,
lot of what I learned I've forgotten.
yeah.
But I think I still like deeply, like somewhere inside me, I do think about the complexity of the code I write, you know? So
Yeah.
it did its job. Anyway, so I went to university, and then pretty much towards the end of university, you know, all my friends were getting jobs. I went to university in the UK, so like people were like looking at like, banking jobs, tech jobs in London. And I was in this like Twitter world of nomads, and all my friends were nomads. I was like, I don't want a job in the UK. I want to go and travel. Like I've just spent the last 23 years, at school, whatever. Last thing I want is to go and work in an office in London. So graduated a month after that. I flew to Bangkok, and that was actually the first time I ever met Peter, um, IRL, which was like 5 years after we started working together. And so yeah, I just nomaded around Asia for 2 years. And then COVID hit, and that changed a lot of stuff. But
Were
let's
you
not
in
go there.
Asia when COVID hit?
I flew back to the UK January 2020 to visit family, and I
Wild,
got stuck in the UK for like a year and a half because of lockdowns. Yeah,
wild. Um. Okay. Wow. That's a wild story. And so, okay, so you've been doing DevOps before that. You went to Asia and you just continued, but also probably enjoyed the food and things like that.
yeah. I kind of just fell into the DevOps role. I don't like. It's not like I'm sitting here thinking, "Wow, I want to do DevOps." It's just naturally what occurred. I've been,
Yeah.
doing servers for a long time. I've been writing code for a long time. DevOps, or at least the field or the role, the job, whatever. It's just the culmination of all these things. It's like writing code, it's maintaining servers, it's developer experience, these kind of things.
You have mastery, right? You totally have mastery of this. I think anyone who listened this long would have no question about that. Is this something you thought about on your journey to get to where you are today? Like, did you ever think about like, I anticipate one day I'm going to have mastery in this field, or I want it, or I'm chasing it, or was it more? And I'm asking this in a very pointed way because I have similar experience. I don't know if I have mastery, but or was it more just like, look, I'm just gonna keep pulling on this thread. I love this stuff. I don't care about mastery. I don't care about who like I like it. It's my hobby.
I think it's definitely the latter.
Yeah.
Like, at no point have I ever thought, about my career or like job titles or anything like that.
Yeah.
My number one like requirement for any job or project, whatever, is that it's fun, and I have to be naturally curious about it. And I think ultimately whether you call it mastery or whether you call it experience, is just because I've done it a lot and I'm naturally curious about it. You know, when I see a bug, I am thinking, why did that occur? Why,
Mm.
what series of events led to that bug? And then I go and debug it. I figure the bug out. I'm like, how did the bug get in the first place? or like, we do have incidents at Ghost, and so for any of the incidents, it's at a point where if the reason isn't what my brain initially like jumped to, that's like a learning experience for my brain. It means that my intuition was wrong, and therefore I like move the neural network a little bit and figure out, and it just trains the brain for next time.
Yeah.
So I think a combination of curiosity and I do find it very exciting.
Yeah, definitely. Prediction error is the stimulus to learn.
Yeah, I think it's a great skill as well. Again, I said earlier, but intuition is just learned experience.
Yeah,
And
I love
so
that.
you see enough of a series of bugs or a series of code, and
Yeah.
you've trained your neural net really well such that you can basically detect that in another set of problems.
Yeah, and if there's people listening to that exact statement you made, and if they're struggling to come up with an example, I think for the vast majority of React developers, it's when you see stale state in your application, you just know it's because your use memo or use callback or use effect doesn't have the right dependency array. You just like instinctively, you've seen this bug so many times that you know it. And if you see a warning in the console or if a list is misbehaving, you've probably not added a key, right? Like it's this kind of thing where you're just like, you've been repeatedly exposed to it so many times that you're like, I get it. And over time, this adds up to intuition and maybe mastery. Okay, Daniel, last question. This is the last thing I will ask you today. And it's maybe difficult to answer, but I think it's important. You've been doing this a long time. How old are you now, if you don't mind me asking?
29, actually. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So you've been doing this like 16 years. That's a long time. And you've been doing this thing with levels for 10 years. In all this time, what's the single biggest technical lesson you learned that you think would be useful for people listening to this episode? One lesson. And I'm not going to give you any
lesson. I would say, similar to what I said earlier, in that the simplest solution is often the best. I think, well, full stop. Do you want an explanation or?
Occam's razor. Feel free, man. But that is the lesson. If you want to explain it, I'm happy to listen.
Yeah. I just, again, for the vast majority of problems that I've seen, a simpler solution would have avoided it. And also the time that you've invested in debugging it or investigating it, it's because of the complexity of the system. And I think that's a sign that you do need to go and simplify your solution.
But you work on a team. Sorry, now I'm asking you another thing. I said it was the last thing. It's supposed to be this big dramatic, but like you've worked in teams, right?
Yeah.
You work on a team right now, probably. And have you had a situation, like an interpersonal situation, where you suggest this? You say, hey, this is a simple thing. It's the simplest solution. Therefore, it's the best. And you have people go like, oh, that can't be like, do you have to deal with interpersonal politics where it's people refuse to accept the simple thing because maybe it's not well thought through or it's naive or some other label that people will attribute to a very simple solution?
Yeah, all the time. And even more so on Twitter, I think.
So how do you engage with?
I think by demonstrating why it would be the better solution, going out of your way to show that. And then I think eventually people come around to the idea.
Right.
Yeah, I think, again, like even on Twitter, Peter tweets out these, tweets of like, okay, I'm using SQLite and whatever. And then guaranteed in the responses you see people saying, oh, but what about Kubernetes? Or what about X complex solution? And then you can just respond, why? Like, what's the problem you're solving? Like, why is this better? It's actually more complex. It's adding more variables into the system. I think by demonstrating it, and in Peter's case, the demonstration is the live site.
Yeah.
No more demonstration needed.
Yeah, totally. I mean, okay, I love that. So it's you make a thesis statement. This is the simplest is the best, and then you back it up literally with the scientific method. Like here, I'll test it. I'll prove it with a demo. Look, it works. Great. There's data. Perfect. Listen, on that note, Daniel, let's leave it here. Thank you so much on behalf of myself and the listener. You've added, I think you've given us so much data and insight across many things. For example, this our solution to monitoring and alerting is we just have cron jobs with Telegram. to the complexity of 27,000 containers at Ghost. But I think if we summarize everything you've ever said here, I think the big message that you've helped me communicate and that you've communicated yourself is you can just build things, and it doesn't have to be scary. Just do it. You can. And so for that exact message, on behalf of myself and everyone listening, thank you so much for coming on and sharing that with us today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me on. It's been good.
Thank you for joining my discussion with Daniel Lockyer. You can just ship things. You can just ship things. You can just ship. Say it with me. You can, hey, build something. Go to Hetzner, go somewhere, get a server, ship something, deploy it, feel proud, and share a link on X. Maybe respond to whatever it is you're watching this on, either a YouTube comment or an X reply or something. If you're learning from and or enjoying this content, honestly, as much as I am, then a great way to support it is to like it on YouTube and subscribe to the channel if that's where you're watching. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, if you leave any review of this up to 5 stars, then the algorithm will know and share it. And of course, if you think any of this knowledge is worth sharing with people, then do it. Like, paste the link to them. If you want to clip it or something and share pieces on social media, that's also fine. Look, ultimately, the reason we do this is to make this content as accessible to as many people so that many people can up-level their skills and have a better life. And so if that's something you want to be a part of, I'd encourage it very much. Thank you so much for being a part of this episode. Thank you for being a part of the podcast. And most importantly, thank you for your interest in engineering.